Okay, so this video is going to be for Module 3 of Marine Biology, and the title of this chapter is The First Four Kingdoms. So you may remember from biology that there are 5 kingdoms. Those kingdoms are Monera, Protista, fungi, Plantae, and Animalia. So much of what we're going to be studying in marine biology is Animalia. So we'll spend really the majority of our time studying organisms that belong to kingdom Animalia. So this chapter, we're going to talk about these first 4 kingdoms. So we'll be working our way in order: Monera, Protista, fungi, and Plantae, and talking about how each of these kingdoms fits into marine biology. So we're going to start with Kingdom Monera. And again, for some of you, this will be review because of our, especially if you did biology at Cornerstone, or if you used the Exploring Creation series by Dr. Weil. A lot of this will be review for you. So in Kingdom Monera, the organisms that fit into Kingdom Monera are bacteria. So what we know about bacteria is that they are single cell. And that one cell is a prokaryotic cell. So we talked about prokaryotic cells last week. And they're microscopic, so they can't be seen unless you have a bunch of them together. They can't be seen without the aid of magnification with a microscope. And you may remember from biology that bacteria come in different shapes. Some are round, some are more rod shaped, and then some are kind of spiral shaped. Well, most of the marine bacteria are rod shaped. So they are bacilli. Okay, so they're shaped more like rods than like circles. These are called cocci, and this is called sporulli. Okay, but for most of the marine bacteria are bacilli. The really cool thing about bacteria is that some of them are able to survive in really extreme environments. So they can survive in extreme temperatures. They can survive in extreme at extreme altitudes. So they can and they can survive deep in the earth. One area that I'm kind of fascinated with right now are bacteria that are found in caves, and they're actually doing a lot of work with those types of bacteria right now because perhaps you know that many diseases that are that humans are susceptible to that are caused by bacteria have become resistant to the antibiotics that we have because we've used antibiotics so much that the organisms adapt and they've become resistant to them. So one of the things that they are doing is they're looking for new bacteria that haven't really been discovered yet, or you may know that the antibiotic penicillin is made from a bacteria, a fungus, and so they're looking for new things in caves that might be able to be used to make new types of antibiotics to fight bacterial infections. So some bacteria are just able to survive really extreme types of environments. Most bacteria are heterotrophs. So most of them do not make their own food, and they are decomposers. So they feed on the remains of dead organisms. And with regard to marine biology, bacteria are found throughout marine environments, and they are especially found in the sediment at the bottom of marine bodies of water. So because bacteria can decompose dead remains on the ocean floor, then that means that those dead remains get recycled back into creation again. So the organisms don't just keep accumulating on the ocean floor. Bacteria are really involved in getting them decomposed and getting those organisms then back into the marine life cycle. Now, I said that most bacteria are heterotrophs. Well, there are some that are autotrophs, and of those that are autotrophs, those that can make their own food, there are really two types. There are those that can do photosynthesis. So obviously, those that can do photosynthesis would need to be near the surface where they can get light. And then there are others that they're autotrophs, but they cannot do photosynthesis. And those that are autotrophs, so they make their own food, but they cannot do photosynthesis. What they do is they do chemosynthesis. Okay, so synthesis means to make something. Chemo means that they use the energy that is in chemicals to produce food. So they don't need the sun to do photosynthesis because they use the energy in chemicals. And then so when a chemical bond is split, that energy is then used for them to produce food. So not all autotrophs, not all autotrophic bacteria do photosynthesis. Okay, then there is another type of bacteria that are called cyanobacteria. And these they almost look like plants. I mean, or they almost act like plants. So we say that they are plant-like. They can do photosynthesis. And the thing about cyanobacteria is that they are found nearly everywhere in a marine environment. So they can withstand a range of salinity and they can withstand a range of temperatures as well. So compared to some other organisms, they're able to survive more extreme environments, and they live. Some of them live on plants. Some of them live on smaller other types of organisms. Some live on the surface of the ocean. Maybe you have heard of a red tide. Last spring and summer, there were pretty extensive red tides along the coast of Florida, and in warm water, these bacteria can multiply very rapidly, and you get this overpopulation of bacteria in an area, and then the sea takes on this red color because of this overpopulation of bacteria. And in some cases, the red tide can be harmful to the sea life, and then if humans consume that sea life, it can be harmful to humans. And also just the presence of the sea tide or the red tide can be irritating to the respiratory systems of humans who are in the area, or some people even feel kind of nauseous when they are around an area where there's a big red tide. So that would be due to cyanobacteria. And one thing I want to particularly point out about cyanobacteria is that cyanobacteria can do nitrogen fixing. Now, some of you who have had chemistry may remember that most of the nitrogen on Earth is in the form of nitrogen gas. So this is nitrogen gas. And so when the air that we're breathing right now is about 84% nitrogen, and it's nitrogen gas. However, that nitrogen gas cannot be used to produce food. So it's in the environment. The vast majority of the air that we breathe is nitrogen, but producers can't use that nitrogen. So what nitrogen fixing is, and what these cyanobacteria can do, is that they take that nitrogen gas and they convert it into NO3. So here's the nitrogen. So they convert nitrogen gas into NO3, and then this can be used by organisms. So that's a really important thing that cyanobacteria can do, is that you can take this nitrogen gas that can't be used can't be used by producers or autotrophs, and convert it into NO3 so that it then can be used. Okay, so that is all I'm going to say about Kingdom Monera, the bacteria. So next we will move on to Kingdom Protista. And I want to give you a little bit of an outline of the things that we will. Well, first of all, let me say a few things, just general things about Kingdom Protista. It's hard to, it's difficult to categorize kingdom Protista because some are plant-like, so some look and act a lot like plants, so they're not plants. Some look and act a lot like animals, although they're not animals. Some are unicellular, so they're single-celled organisms, and then others are multicellular. So it's difficult when we start to try to classify kingdom Protista. It can be difficult, and not all scientists agree on how they should be classified. So I want to give you an outline. We're gonna break kingdom Protista down into 3 areas, and we'll talk about each one of those. But first, let me go ahead and list each one first. So the first one that we'll talk about are unicellular. And we're going to talk about unicellular. Algae is a member of kingdom Protista. So we'll do unicellular algae, and under that we're going to focus primarily on 2, the diatoms and the dinoflagellates. Okay, so that's one of our 3 categories of kingdom Protista that we'll talk about. Then we're going to do marine protozoans. And there's 3 different types of those that we'll talk about. I'll write them here. The first one is foraminiferans. Foraminiferans. Then we will talk about radiolarians. And lastly, we'll talk about the ciliates. Okay, so that's the marine protozoans. And then the last one that we'll talk about are the multicellular algae. Okay, so we did the unicellular, we'll do multicellular algae. And under that, we're going to talk about green, brown, and red. Okay, so that's an overview of where we are going. And so we're just going to work our way in order through this list of organisms that are part of kingdom Protista. Okay, so let's start with the unicellular algae. So first of all, let's talk about algae in general first. So we say that algae, when it's plural, we say this alga. They're pretty simple organisms. And as I said, some act like plants, but they don't have stems and leaves and roots like a plant. Some act like animals. They live in water. They usually do photosynthesis, and they come in various colors, as we'll see. And some of them have flagella so that they can swim. So that's kind of general characteristics of algae, but some are unicellular and some are multicellular. So let's look at the unicellular first. So they're single-celled, and if you have heard the word phytoplankton, when we talk about phytoplankton, we're talking about the unicellular algae. So these are organisms that float or drift on the water. And you probably know that they are a major food source for many organisms that are part of kingdom Animalia, marine animals. The two main organisms that under this that we are going to talk about are the diatoms and the dinoflagellates. So let's start with the diatoms. And I have some there's some pictures in your book, but I have some other ones also that I want to show you. So the diatoms, they are very plentiful, especially in warm water. And they produce the greatest amount of oxygen. So they produce, of all the organisms that are on Earth, they produce the greatest amount of oxygen. So obviously they are extremely important to the ecosystem. So it's not plants that produce the greatest amount of oxygen. It is these phytoplankton, specifically the diatoms. Their cell walls are comprised of silicon dioxide. And this is kind of like, it's kind of glass-like. And so it has some abrasive qualities to it. And so if you go home and take a look at your toothpaste, to take a look at the ingredients in your toothpaste, one of the ingredients that might be listed is silica. Pretty commonly used in toothpaste because of those abrasive qualities. It's used to, the abrasion is used to clean things off of our teeth. Besides that, it is also used in industry for filtering things. And sometimes it's also used for insulation. So all of those things they're useful for those things because of this glass-like substance that make up their cell walls. When the diatoms die, they settle on the bottom of the earth, or I'm sorry, the bottom of the ocean. And they can accumulate down there. So then what we end up with is diatomaceous earth. And this diatomaceous earth is then collected, and it is what is used in toothpaste and filtering, insulation. So next time you brush your teeth, you can remember that what you're brushing your teeth with are the cell walls of these dead diatoms. Let me show you show some pictures here. So here's if I can blow this up a little bit, let's see. So this middle picture is a picture of some diatoms. They're beautiful when you look at them under a microscope. And this, this cell wall around here, I guess I can't write. Oh, I guess I can only write on it if it's large, if it's small. I'd like to blow it up. So. Okay, so the cell wall around these is what is made of silicone, and they come in different shapes, and under a microscope you can see different colors in them as well. So that's just a figure of some diatoms. When we look at the reproduction of these organisms, I'm not going to ask you to, I'm not going to ask you to give me details about this. So diatoms can reproduce sexually, and they can also reproduce asexually. So I do want you to know that. So when you look at a diatom, what they basically look like is they look like a box with a lid. So here's a box. And then that box has like a lid on it. Okay, and that structure is called a frustule, the long U, Frustule. So there are a couple ways that they can reproduce asexually. And one way that they can reproduce asexually is just that the box and the lid separate from each other, and then they each form the other part. Okay, so here we have the box, the bottom part, and then it just forms the top part. Or you can have the top part and it will form the bottom part. So that's one way that they can reproduce asexually. Another way is just that this frustule can just form into a new cell, and that's called an oxospore. That's another way they can reproduce asexually. But then lastly, the frustules can actually form egg and sperm, and then they reproduce sexually. So bottom line that I want you to know about the diatoms is that they can reproduce both asexually and sexually. You don't need to know the details about how that happens, but just be aware that, but do know that they can reproduce both asexually and sexually. Okay, so now let's go back to our discussion of the protozoa, and the next one we're going to do are the dinoflagellates. So this di means two, so this just means that they have two flagella, and one of those flagella is kind of wrapped around the middle of it, and the other is like a tail, like we normally think of a flagella. Most of the dinoflagellates have chlorophyll. And they do photosynthesis. So remember that chlorophyll is the pigment that acts as a catalyst for photosynthesis. A few of them can consume other food, but most of them do photosynthesis to get their food. Another thing that we talked about in biology, some of them have light spots, so that it's like an eye type thing where that is just sensitive to light. So they will move toward light, which obviously is helpful for them when they are seeking out light to do photosynthesis. They reproduce asexually, so there's no form of sexual reproduction in the dinoflagellates. And they can also reproduce very, very rapidly. And so they when they do that, they also can lead to a red tide because of their very rapid reproduction. The last thing I will say about the diatoms and the dinoflagellates is that some of them have bioluminescence. And we'll see this in other marine organisms as we go out, but this just means that they can produce their own light. So you can, if they have bioluminescence, you can see a slight glow to them. And the dinoflagellates are able to they have bioluminescence, they can produce their own light. Okay, so that was the single-celled algae. Okay, next we're going to go to the second category, which are the marine protozoa. And the thing that is true of all of the marine protozoa is that they all have a means of locomotion. So they have a way to move. Most of them are heterotrophs. They are eukaryotic and they are unicellular. So heterotrophs, usually unicellular, not all, but most are unicellular, and their cells are eukaryotic. Okay, so they're the more organized type of cell. Under the marine protozoa, we use some different words to express the different types. So there's zooplankton. So this means animal. So these are animal-like. But they're not animals. And because they have the word plankton, that means that they drift in the water. Then two other types that your book mentions are the holoplankton and the meroplankton. And the difference between these two is that the holoplankton spend their entire lives as plankton, whereas the narrow plankton, they're only plankton in the larval stage. So they would drift during that phase, but then they're no longer plankton. So they're plankton only during the larval phase. So they spend part of their life as a in the plankton phase, but then the rest of their life they do not. So then I mentioned that I meant the three organisms that I mentioned under marine protozoa are the foraminiferans, the radiolarians, and then lastly the ciliates. Okay, so the foraminiferans, they have pseudopods. So remember we said that they all have a means of locomotion. Well, these have pseudopods. And remember from biology, a pseudopod is a false foot. So they move their cytoplasm into an area of their plasma membrane that extends out, and they move their whole body into that extension. They have a shell that is called a test. I don't know why it's called a test. It's kind of chalk-like, and so when they die and sink to the bottom, you get these deposits of chalk-like substances that build up, and eventually there are parts of the world where enough of those have accumulated that they actually stick up above the water. So it's this shell, kind of chalk-like shell that they have. Most of the radiolarians are spherical. I'll show you some pictures of all of these in a moment. Their shells are also made of silica, like we saw with the diatoms. And so they also can kind of sink to the bottom, and you can get this accumulation. And then the ciliates, as their name implies, they use cilia for locomotion. And remember the cilia they're kind of shorter flagella, but they're much more abundant. So usually if an organism has flagella, they just have one or two, whereas with cilia, they'll have, lots and lots of cilia, and they'll use those cilia for locomotion. So let me show you some pictures here. Okay, so this is a picture of a dinoflagellate. I forgot the point to get this. So remember, a dinoflagellate has two flagella. So there's one flagella that is around the middle here, and then the other one is like the tail-like flagella that we more commonly think of. You saw this picture in biology if you took biology. Okay, so these are the foraminiferin, the radiolaurin, and the ciliate. So both of them have these pseudopods, so where they form these substances out of them that are used for locomotion, and then the ciliates use the cilia for their locomotion. Okay, so that is the second group under the kingdom Protista, the marine protozoan. Okay, and then the last one we have to do are the multicellular algae. And really, so these are eukaryotic. And they're multicellular, so that's multicell. And when we think of multicellular algae, what we are generally talking about are the seaweeds. Okay, now keep in mind that they are not plants. Okay, so they don't have leaves, they don't have stems, they don't have roots. Because they're not true plants. Some may look like they have leaves. So let me show you a picture here. So here is an example. This is a picture of kelp, and they may look like they have leaves, but they don't. Those are called blades, and so these are not true leaves because they don't have veins. Leaves have veins. So these are called blades. And then three other structures really that you should know of. One is the pneumatocyst. So a pneumatocyst is a structure that can be filled with air. And that means then that when they fill with air, they won't sink, they'll stay closer to the surface. And remember, these are going to do photosynthesis, so if they are closer to the surface, then that increases their chance of being exposed to sunlight. The stem here, what looks like a stem is really called a stipe. And then the other thing that they don't have roots. So what they have in place of roots are these holdfasts. And those are really just to anchor. It's not a very good color on that blue. So the holdfasts serve as an anchor, but they are not roots. Remember that in real plants, nutrients and water get absorbed up through those roots. That doesn't happen with a holdfast. The holdfast is really just serving as an anchor. And in fact, in kelp or in other types of seaweeds, the water and the nutrients can get absorbed directly through the cells because they're constantly being bathed in the water. Okay, so that's a difference between plants and seaweeds, is that you don't need the root and stem system for the absorption of nutrients, because they're being bathed in the water and can just absorb them directly. Okay, so that is an example of, kelp is a good example of a seaweed. So I mentioned that the multicellular algae there's green, brown, and red. And as you might guess, the colors are based on the pigments that they have. So green has chlorophyll that gives it its green color. Brown algae has more of a yellowish pigment, and because of that pigment, it can appear kind of olive or brown. And then the pigment that is in red is called phycobilins. I think the only, well, let me say just I'll show you a picture of one of the types of green algae. So this is a type of green algae called Halimeda. The interesting thing about this is that this has calcium carbonate on it, or it can get deposits of calcium carbonate. Can I get a white color? Yeah. So this type of algae can actually get white deposits on them, and those white deposits are calcium carbonate. Calcium carbonate is, if you eat a Tums, that's calcium carbonate, and the calcium carbonate can be formed on this particular type of green algae. If it sinks to the bottom of the ocean, then that actually can serve as a base for coral to live on. So that's kind of an interesting thing about that type of green algae. Let me say just a few more things about brown and red. For some of you from biology, this will be a review, but brown algae, one substance that we get from brown algae is called algin. And it's an agent that helps to like thicken things, or it also helps oil and vinegar to stay together. Normally oil and vinegar would separate from each other. But if you buy a bottle of salad dressing, and if you look on it, you might see that it has the ingredient algin in it. So it's used for thickening. And this is particularly used in salad dressings. So when next time you're eating ranch dressing, remind yourself that what you're really eating is you're getting some brown algae in that. And then red algae, I'll just erase all of it. Red algae has a substance in it that is called carrageenan. And this also is it's used for thickening. So if look at your ice cream, or some like puddings also have carrageenan in it, so it's a form of red algae. If you've ever grown bacteria on an agar plate, so this is it's the medium that's used to grow bacteria. So like on a petri dish, that also is a form of red algae. So I know in biology class here at Cornerstone, we do grow bacteria on petri dishes, and the nutrient agar that we use is derived from that red algae. One more thing that I will say about the multicellular algae is that when they reproduce with alternation of generations. I'll show you a picture. And again, you studied this in biology, so I'm not going to ask you for details on it. But what you should know about alternation of generations is that they go from a spore generation, which comes from asexual reproduction, and then they also form gametes, which of course is sexual reproduction. So they form egg and sperm, and they go through sexual reproduction. So they alternate. When we say alternation of generations, they alternate between the spore and the gamete generation. So let me show you a picture of that. So this is, again, you don't need to know the details of this, but here is the spore generation here. And then they go through a generation where they form gametes. And you get the egg and the sperm, and then you get a diploid zygote, and then you can go back to the spore generation. Okay, so from haploid spores to a diploid zygote, then you go back again to the haploid spores. I'm sorry, back here, haploid gametes, and then back to the haploid spores. So alternation of generations happens in the multicellular algae. Okay, we're almost done. Just want to say, so that's pretty much the information that we're going to talk about with regard to the three groups of the three topics that I said that we were going to talk about in Kingdom Protista. So let me just, so we did Monera, and then for Protista, I said we were going to do the unicellular algae. So we did that. And then I said we were going to do the protozoa, the marine protozoa. So we talked about 3 different organisms there. And then the last thing that we did was the multicellular algae. Okay, so that leaves us then to just do fungi, and plants. And we're not going to say a lot about these two, but I will say a few things about them. So let's look at fungus first. Fungi. As you know, there are fungus on land, but there's also marine fungi. So there are fungi that are in marine environments. They are eukaryotic. So they have the more organized type of cell. They are multicellular. And they are decomposers. So they don't do photosynthesis. They live on, they digest and consume and use as their food source the remains of dead organisms. So that's all we're going to say about fungus at this point. And then let me say just a few things about kingdom Plantae. So remember, a plant has leaves, they have stems, and they have roots. Okay. So here we're really talking about sea grasses. So not seaweeds. We saw that seaweed is not a true plant, but the sea grasses are. So many of these, they tend to live in warm water and in shallow water. And they have flowers and seeds, just like they reproduce with flowers and seeds, just like other plants reproduce with flowers and seeds. So remember on land plants that the pollen needs to have ways to get carried from, a flower can self-pollinate, but there are also cases where the pollen from the male needs to get carried to another flower so that it can meet up with the ovary of the female. So on land plants, that happens through the wind, or insects getting the pollen on their body, or birds and carrying it from plant to plant. Well, in the seagrasses, the sperm can move on the water. So unlike land plants where the flowers are colorful or fragrant as a way of attracting birds or bees that can then carry the pollen off, that's not necessary in the water because the sperm are able to move in the water and they can reach the female in that way. Okay, so that's the seagrasses. So they are true water plants. They live in the water. There are two other types of plants that I'll mention that aren't really true water plants, but this is a good time to talk about them. And those are saltwater marsh plants. And they're land plants, so they're not true water plants. They're land plants. But they are land plants that can tolerate high concentrations of salt. So they can tolerate a salty environment. So they tend to be in soft, sandy areas along the shore, but they're not strictly, they live on the land, but can be surrounded by salt water. So they actually have special glands in their leaves where they can get rid of excess salt. So that's kind of cool. And then the last type of plant that I'll mention that again is not a true water plant, but it's a land plant, are the mangroves. And the mangroves also are a land plant that are salt tolerant. I'll show you a picture of one here in just a moment. They're salt tolerant, but they're not frost tolerant. So they tend to, you'll tend to see them in the tropics or subtropics. So they live in warmer climates because they can't tolerate the frost, even though they can tolerate salt. One type of mangrove is called a red mangrove. And these are kind of cool because their seeds, when their seeds sprout, they actually sprout while they're hanging from the branches of the parent, and then they'll keep growing until they get heavy enough that they fall into the water, and they'll float there until they eventually settle down, and they'll put down roots, and they'll anchor there, and they'll develop roots, and as they produce new plants and new roots, then other sediment can actually kind of get trapped in there among their roots and plants, and they can form an island. So you can get an island formed from a mangrove tree. Let me show you a picture of one of those. So again, they're not a true water plant because they don't live strictly in the water. They live They live on the shore, but they are tolerant to the salt. So here's a red mangrove. You can see the roots that develop here, and so they're true plants because they develop these roots. And then when the seeds actually start growing on the mother plant, and then when they get heavy enough, they fall into the water, and then those will develop into seedlings and grow into another plant. And then, as I said, as more and more of these grow, then sediment can settle in around there, and you can actually get an island formed around these red mangrove trees. Okay, so I think that's all that we are going to say about Module 3. As I said, most of the rest of the course we will be focusing on animals. So this chapter covered the other 4 kingdoms: Kingdom Onera, Kingdom Protista, Kingdom Fungi, and Kingdom Plantae. Okay, that's it.